Okay, so this is a continuation of our discussion in the digestive system, and this will be included in our quiz next meeting. So let's start our discussion of part two, of the digestive system. So in our last discussion, we said that the digestive tract is a long muscular tube that extends from the mouth down to the anus, and it is composed of the mouth or the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestines, the large intestines, and the anus. So let us describe those vital structures of the oral cavity. So the oral cavity, the opening of the oral cavity is guarded by the lips, which is made up of muscular structures formed primarily by the muscle orbicularis oris. You have identified that in the muscular system, during our class in the laboratory. And that orbicularis oris is covered by the lips. While the cheek, or the lateral walls of the oral cavity is also made up of another skeletal muscle, and that is your buccinator muscle. The function of our buccinator muscle is to compress or to flatten the cheeks, yung lateral cheeks natin, against our teeth, especially when we are chewing or masticating food. While on the floor of the stomach, on the floor, stomach rather, on the floor of the oral cavity, you have a large muscular organ, which is a combination of smooth and skeletal muscles, our tongue. Our tongue is important not only for communication, for speaking and articulation, but also for the process of swallowing or deglutition. Okay, you will see later that during the process of swallowing, the tongue moves the food in the mouth, and in cooperation with the lips and the cheek, they hold the food in place during mastication. That is why, for those patients who will have paralysis of the tongue, for example, among patients who suffered from stroke, they will have problem not only in communication, speaking or talking, but also in terms of swallowing. Patients who have uh, or who suffer from stroke, sometimes suffer from dysphagia, the medical term that is used for difficulty swallowing. So those are the important muscles, playing an important role in our oral cavity. Again, you have your orbicularis oris surrounding the opening of the oral cavity, okay, which makes up the lips. And then you also have the buccinator muscle, which makes up the walls of the cheeks. And you have the tongue, which is both a skeletal and a smooth muscle located on the floor of the oral cavity. Now, in the oral cavity, you will also find yung ating teeth. In a normal adult, we have 32 sets of teeth. 32, lahat yan. Okay? While in children, we have only 20 primary or deciduous teeth, or sometimes we call it the milk teeth. Okay? So, as you can see, in an adult, in a normal adult, your sets of teeth are, you have your incisors, your canine, your premolars, molars, and your third molar, sometimes known as the wisdom tooth. Kaya makikita mo dito, you have your first molar, your second molar, and your third molar. So in an adult, no, we have all in all, pag binilang mo yan, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All in all, you have 12 molars, no? Because it's 3 times 4. Oh, di ba? So 12 lahat yan. 6 sa baba, 6 sa taas. Okay? Then, okay, you have how many premolars? Okay, ang premolars natin, you have 1, 2. O, times 4 ulit yan. You have 8. You have 8 premolars. Then, you have your canine or canine. No? Canine, isa lang yan. So, times 4. So, we have 4 canine teeth. And then you have your lateral incisor. Isa lang din yan. Times 4. So you have 4 lateral incisor. And then your central incisor, dalawa yan. Sometimes ito yung malaki sa inyo na parang Bugs Bunny. No? That is your central incisor. Okay? And since dalawa times 4, you have 8. You add it up all and you come up with 32. Again, all in all, teeth in the normal adult. Okay? By the way, your wisdom tooth normally erupts around 19 to 21 years old. That is why yung wisdom tooth, the eruption of the wisdom tooth, is a good indicator of maturity. Usually, minors, those people whose age 18 years old and below, mga wala pang erupted wisdom tooth yan. That is why, diba, when someone claims to be an adult already, okay, yung mga nagfe-fake ng edad, like for example, yung mga minors that are being rescued sa mga beer house or yung mga anong tawag dito, prostitution din, yung mga minors na babae. One way of verifying their age is through the examination of their teeth. Okay? So, kapag hindi pa erupted ang kanilang wisdom tooth or yung kanilang third molar, it just means that they are still minors. Okay? 17 years old and below. Okay? Now, so it's a good indicator of maturity. So remember, again, we have 32 teeth in a normal adult. And okay, we have 20 primary deciduous or milk teeth in children. Now, let's now go to the walls of the oral cavity, specifically your palate. It is pronounced as palate, not palate. The palate, or in Tagalog, we call it your ngalangala, serves as the roof of the oral cavity. And it is divided into two sections. The one that is made up of the bone is your hard palate, while the one that is made up of skeletal muscle and some connective tissues is your soft palate. And hanging on the center of your soft palate, on the most posterior aspect of the soft palate, is the uvula. Okay, so usually the uvula can be seen when you ask the patient to open his mouth wide. Buka mo yung bibig ng malaking-malaki, and using a pen light or a flashlight, you will be able to see not only the soft palate, but also the walls of the patient's pharynx or the patient's throat. Okay? So what is the significance of your palate, no? Both the hard and the soft palate? It serves to separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. Or if the palate serves as the roof of the oral cavity, it also serves as the floor of the nasal cavity. So therefore, it separates the nasal from the oral cavity. Any congenital defect in your palate, no? Pagka may congenital defect ka sa iyong palate, that is called cleft palate. No? Cleft palate. And usually, no, people with cleft palate will have difficulty in articulation, no? Meaning in speaking, in talking, so therefore they will have difficulty in communication. Sila yung nagiging ngongo, no? Because instead of, no, yung air, no, is passing separately through the mouth and through the nose, no, nagkakaroon ngayon ng pagsingaw ng hangin from the mouth to the nose and vice versa because of the defect in the cleft palate. Okay? Or yung cleft palate nga. Okay? So nagiging ngongo, no, yung pasyente kapag kaganyan. So again, the palate is divided into two sections, hard palate and the soft palate. Now, another important structures, no, that are found in the oral cavity are your salivary glands. And we have 3 pairs of salivary glands. All in all, 6 yan. No? So what are the functions of the salivary gland? It mainly produces saliva, which is a mixture of serous, meaning watery consistency, and mucus fluid. No? Okay, so when you say serous, watery, while mucus meaning thick, no, fluid. And the main functions of the saliva is to keep the oral cavity moist. It is needed for normal speech. It dissolves the food particles so that they can be tasted. No? Okay? It protects against bacteria and neutralizes the pH of the mouth. And the saliva begins the process of digestion. When we chew our food and it is completely mixed with our saliva, it becomes partially digested. No? And that mass of food that is completely chewed or masticated, that is completely mixed in our saliva, that is ready for swallowing, is now called bolus. Bolus, again, is already partially digested. So as we have said earlier, we have 3 pairs of salivary gland. You have your parotid, submandibular, and sublingual salivary glands. The parotid gland, no, are serous gland located anterior to each ear, overlying your masseter muscle. No? Nandito siya sa angle of the mandible. No? And your parotid glands are serous glands, meaning they secrete watery secretions. Okay? While your submandibular gland, no, are located right beneath the mandible. So this is a cutaway view, no, of our mandible for you to be able to see the submandibular gland. So ito, they produce both serous and mucus secretions, but it produces more serous than mucus secretions. So, mixture, pero mas marami pa rin yung serous. And lastly, you have your sublingual salivary gland that are found underneath our tongue. And while your sublingual salivary glands produces mainly mucus secretions. Again, mainly mucus secretions. That is why, no, sometimes, no, we experience dry mouth, di ba? Oh, especially kapag medyo matagal nang nagsasalita, no? Tapos you do not drink no, enough amount of water, tendency is for your mouth, no, to get dry. Okay? While sometimes naman, no, your mouth tends to be watering. No? Kailan ba nagkakaroon ng watering of the mouth? Like for example, no, at the sight of delicious food, especially kung yung mga maaasim na pangkain like mangga, hilaw na mangga, kamyas, di ba? The tendency is for your salivary gland to secrete more serous or watery secretions. So, sometimes nga, kapag nakakita ka ng kumakain ng kamyas, di ba? You will also notice na aside from salivation, no, your mouth becomes watery, you will feel that your parotid gland is contracting. No? You will feel a contraction or parang nagkakaroon ng anong tawag doon? Cramping sensation on the anterior part of your ear. Di ba? Okay? Pag nangangasim tayo, it's because of the contraction of the ducts of your parotid gland. So again, remember, you have your parotid gland, submandibular gland, and sublingual gland. We have one pair of each of those glands. So all in all, we have 6 salivary glands in the oral cavity. Now, the serous portion of the saliva contains 2 kinds of enzymes. No? What are those enzymes? First is amylase. No? Amylase is the digestive enzyme present in our saliva that initially breaks down carbohydrates. So therefore, the chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins already at the or in the oral cavity through the action of our amylase, no? Which is found in the saliva. You have to remember, we have said that when we eat, no? For example, ang maganda example is hamburger. Kasi yung hamburger, nandun na yung tatlong chemical food groups, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So, ibig sabihin, the carbohydrate content of that hamburger is already being digested chemically as early as the oral cavity through the action of the amylase. Now, another enzyme is your lysozyme. Okay, so this enzyme is not essential for digestion, but rather, okay, this is an enzyme that is active against the bacteria. So these are the 2 enzymes found in the serous portion of the saliva. While in the mucous portion, okay, is not an enzyme, but rather a substance called mucin, which is very important for lubrication. Importante kasi that the bolus is lubricated before being swallowed. Otherwise, it will be stuck in our esophagus, in our throat, babarayan if it is not completely lubricated. It will result to choking, di ba? Okay? So let us continue. So we have just finished the oral cavity, the vital structures found in the oral cavity. So remember that. So after the oral cavity, if this is the oral cavity, okay, so you are now ready to swallow your food and push that bolus into the pharynx. Okay? Now, as you can see here in the illustration, the pharynx is divided into 3 sections: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Now, the section that is vital for the digestive system is our oropharynx. Okay, yung oropharynx, yan lang yung dadaanan ng bolus as we swallow. Okay? Kapag nilunok na natin yung pagkain. The pharynx is a passageway for both the digestive and the respiratory system. You have to remember, the pharynx, okay, is also part of the respiratory tract. Kaya makikita nyo, the superior portion of the pharynx, no, is located, no, at the back of the nasal cavity. So therefore, it's called nasopharynx. While the inferior portion of the pharynx is located near, no, uh, the larynx, which is part of the digestive tract. Kaya ang tawag doon is your laryngopharynx. When we inhale air during respiration from the nasal cavity, air goes into your nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. But when we swallow food from the oral cavity, it will just pass through the oropharynx, then down to the esophagus. Okay? So again, it is a passageway for both the digestive and the respiratory system. Okay? Now, so let us continue. So after the food is swallowed, diretso na ngayon yan sa esophagus. The esophagus is a tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. It functions to transport the food to the stomach. And the esophagus joins the stomach at the cardiac opening. Di ba ganitong itsura niya? Like for example, no, if this is the esophagus, okay, then you have the stomach. Di ba? Ayan siya. You have the stomach. Okay. This is the small intestine. So, as I have said earlier, the lower end of the esophagus joins the stomach at the cardiac opening. This opening, right at where the esophagus joins the stomach, is called cardiac opening. And it has a sphincter muscle that guards it, which is called cardiac sphincter. Okay? So usually, among people with hyperacidity, okay, there is this tendency for these gastric juices, yung mga acidic gastric juices, to regurgitate back into the esophagus. And when that happens, the patient usually feels a burning sensation on the chest because of the irritation of the lower esophagus, okay, due to the presence or regurgitation of the gastric juices. You have to remember, the gastric juices is so acidic that its pH is equivalent to a pH of 2.0. So, ganun ka-acidic yan. Okay? So, kung ganun ka-acidic siya, pag napunta yan sa lower esophagus, it can cause irritation of the lower esophagus. Again, causing a burning sensation over the chest. Kaya tinawag siyang heartburn because sometimes it is mistaken by patients as heart problem. Kasi sa chest kasi nararamdaman. Parang may burning sensation sa chest. But in actuality, it is actually irritation of the lower esophagus. Okay, yung heartburn. So what are the causes of that? Caffeine, smoking, overeating, or drinking in excess. If heartburn, frequently occurs, it is already due to a specific condition called the GERD or yung GERD. Pagka laging na-heartburn na pasyente, okay, the doctor arrives at a diagnosis na tinatawag na GERD, stands for gastroesophageal reflux disease. So, yun na nga. Ang nangyayari doon, yung nangyayari sa heartburn na paulit-ulit. Wherein, yung gastric juices regurgitate into the lower esophagus. Huh? Okay. Now, the only treatment for GERD, no, is symptomatic relief, meaning, no, to minimize or to eliminate the symptoms, usually by pharmacologic, no, or medical means. Usually, ang ibinibigay sa pasyente yung mga antacids, no, meaning, okay, those that control hyperacidity. Para mabawasan yung na-experience niya heartburn. So that is your esophagus. Okay, now, so yung propulsion of the bolus from the oral cavity through the pharynx to the esophagus involves a physiologic process of swallowing called deglutition. And the physiological process of swallowing is divided into 3 phases. First, you have the voluntary phase, the pharyngeal phase, and the esophageal phase of swallowing. The first phase is called voluntary phase, wherein the food is already being prepared to be swallowed, but still in the oral cavity. It is called voluntary phase because it happens, okay, at your own will. While you are in the voluntary phase of swallowing, you can still decide either to continue swallowing or to spit out the food that you are eating. Like for example, habang inunguya mo yung pagkain, nalasahan mo na parang panis na, di ba? Your tendency is not to continue swallowing it, but rather to spit it out. So, nasa voluntary phase of swallowing ka na kapag ka gano'n. But, once the bolus touches the back of your throat, specifically, your pharynx, you are already in the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. And in the pharyngeal phase of swallowing, as you can see, the soft palate already elevates and there is already successive contractions of the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Because our pharynx is surrounded by constrictor muscles. And when they contract successively, it is a result of a reflex that is triggered by the presence, mere presence of food in the throat. And we can no longer control that. That's why when yung food is already in the pharynx, tuloy-tuloy na yan pababa. You can no longer control that because it is no longer voluntary, but rather a result of a reflex. Kaya makikita nyo, again, there is successive contraction of the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Tatlo yan your superior pharyngeal constrictor, the middle pharyngeal constrictor, and the inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscle. They contract successively in order to push yung bolus of food down the esophagus. Which brings us now to the third and final phase of swallowing, which is the esophageal phase of swallowing. Here, there is already passage of food into the esophagus, resulting to the peristaltic contraction of the esophagus. So once yung bolus pasok sa esophagus natin, o-contract yan in a peristaltic manner, peristalsis, in order to propel the food down to the stomach. Pasok na ngayon sa stomach, yung pagkain. And we all know that the stomach is located in the abdomen. And since it is the only expanded portion of the gastrointestinal tract, it serves as a storage tank for food, so that it can stay in the stomach for a couple of hours until it is converted into a semi-liquid consistency called chyme. No? So ang tawag natin kapag yung bolus na convert na into a semi-liquid consistency wherein it is already mixed with the gastric juices, it is now called chyme. Now the stomach can hold up to 2 liters of food. And its main function is to produce mucus. It produces hydrochloric acid also, and it produces a particular enzyme that is important for the digestion of protein. No? O kung sa oral cavity, sa serous portion of the saliva, we have the salivary amylase for the digestion of carbohydrates. In the stomach, we have enzymes, no, that functions to digest protein naman. So our stomach contains a thick mucus, mucus layer that lubricates and protects the epithelial cells on the stomach wall from the acidic pH. In fact, no, on the entire length of the digestive tract, it is in the stomach where the mucous membrane is thickest. Yan ang pinakamakapal. Again, because its main function, aside from lubrication, is to protect the epithelial cells from the acidic pH of the gastric juices. Okay, so let us continue. So the mucosa of the stomach forms tube-like gastric pits. No? Kung titingnan niyo yung drawing na to, saan ba yan? No? So as you can see, if you will look at the mucosa of the stomach, if you will enlarge this wall of the stomach, no? Ayan, if you will look at the mucosa layer of the stomach, it has gastric pits, inward foldings of the mucous membrane. Okay? O, anong function ng gastric pits na yan? Okay? These are the openings for the gastric gland, no? So that yung mga secretions nila can readily come out from the walls of the stomach. The epithelial cells of the stomach can be divided into 5 groups. You have the surface mucous cells, the mucous neck cells. These are both mucous cells, so therefore they both secrete mucus. You also have parietal cells, endocrine cells, and chief cells. Okay, iba-ibang function yung mga yan. Okay. Both the surface mucous cells and the mucous neck cells produce mucus. O kaya napakakapal ng mucus stomach natin. While the parietal cells, no, secretes 2 important substances, no, for the digestive process in the stomach. It secretes hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factors. O importante sa digestion, yung dalawang yan. Later, we will be discussing that. While endocrine cells, no, since it is an endocrine cell, it produces certain hormones which also functions to regulate the process of digestion in our stomach. And it also produces certain paracrine molecules. While the chief cells produce a factor called pepsinogen. And pepsinogen, no, is a precursor, meaning inactive form muna. Pepsinogen is an inactive form of a protein digesting enzyme called pepsin. So ibig sabihin, the chief cells secretes pepsinogen, and then later, pepsinogen is converted into an active enzyme called pepsin. Now the question is, what triggers the conversion of pepsinogen into pepsin? It is actually the action of your hydrochloric acid. That is one function of your hydrochloric acid. to convert pepsinogen into pepsin. Okay? Now, so as we have said earlier, no, the environment in the stomach has a pH of about 2.0. No? And because of that acidic pH, it is able to kill, no, certain harmful microorganisms in the stomach. And as we have said earlier, no, the hydrochloric acid also activates pepsin. Now, what is the main function of pepsin? O, nasabi na natin kanina. It functions to digest proteins. O, kasi kung ganito ang protein, no, di ba, usually, itsura ng protein, napakahabang chain of amino acid molecules. Mahabang chain yan ng amino acid molecules. Yan. Okay? And what binds them are covalent bonds. Diba? Yan. Ang ginagawa ni pepsin is that ginagawa ni pepsin is that it is an enzyme, no, that functions to break those bonds so that yung proteins, instead of a very, very long chain, it is broken down into smaller peptide chains. Okay? Okay. Now, alam na natin yan, that your mucus, no? Okay, functions to, the mucus functions to lubricate, no, the mucosa of the stomach. It also protects the mucosa, again, from the acidic kind and acidic pepsin. Now, another secretion of the stomach is your intrinsic factor. Napaka-importante ng intrinsic factor because, no, it makes your vitamin B12, no, absorbable by the gastrointestinal tract. Without intrinsic factor, you will not be able to absorb vitamin B12 and it will result to vitamin B12 deficiency. Pagka meron kang vitamin B12 deficiency, you suffer from anemia. Specifically, the type of anemia that's called pernicious anemia, because vitamin B12 is important in the DNA synthesis of and red blood cell production. So, di ba? Red blood cell. Kaya kung kulang sa vitamin B12, it results to anemia, particularly pernicious anemia. Now, so napakarami, no, nung mga na-enumerate natin na secretions of the stomach: hydrochloric acid, pepsin, mucus, and intrinsic factor. Now, the secretion, no, of those gastric juices from the cells of the stomach is regulated, no, by parasympathetic stimulation, certain hormones such as gastrin, histamine, no? Yung mga yan, no, they tend to increase the stomach secretions. Okay. And the secretion, no, or the increase in the secretions of the stomach, kasi yung secretions ng stomach natin, ano yan nagfa-fluctuate, no? Tumataas, dumadami, minsan konti, tumataas, dumadami. So, usually, no, kapag siya ay dumadami or yung trigger ng pagdami ng secretion sa stomach is divided into 3 phases. The cephalic phase, gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. Okay? So, let's create a scenario, for example. No? Ano ba yung mga instances wherein the secretions of the stomach usually increase? Siyempre, number 1, kapag nakaamoy ka ng masarap na pagkain or nakakita ka ng masarap na pagkain. Did you know that kahit hindi ka pa kumakain o hindi mo pa sinusubo yung pagkain, the mere fact, no, that you smell something delicious or may nakita ka na masarap na pagkain, the secretions of the stomach will already increase. Okay. So, ang tawag doon is the cephalic phase of gastric secretion. In the cephalic phase of gastric secretion, the stomach secretions are initiated only by sight, smell, taste, or food thought. Kasama yung taste, kasi yung pagkain nasa bibig pa lang. Hindi mo pa sinaswallow. It's just in the mouth. No? Okay? So, by just sight, by smell, by taste, or by food thought, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, mucus, and intrinsic factor, gastrin, and histamine are released in the stomach. Okay? Again, taste, smell, or thought of food, no, will already stimulate your hypothalamus and in turn send signals to your medulla oblongata. And through the vagus nerve, no? Kasi yung vagus nerve, it is from the medulla oblongata to the stomach. Through or via the vagus nerve that carries action potential to the stomach, yung, no? Yung, again, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, mucus, and intrinsic factor, gastrin, and histamine are released in the stomach. That is why, no? If someone is hungry, di ba usually pagka gutom tayo, sumasakit na yung tiyan natin eh. Nangangasim na yung sikmura natin pag gutom na tayo. And then suddenly, nakaamoy ka ng masarap na pagkain. Di ba? O what's the tendency? O kapag gutom na gutom ka, nakaamoy ka pa ng masarap na pagkain. Di ba lalong kumakalam yung sikmura, lalong nangangasim, lalong sumasakit yung tiyan natin. You know why? Because, no, of the cephalic phase of stomach secretions. Okay, gutom ka na nga. And nakaamoy ka pa ng pagkain. Smell it. Okay, nakaisip ka pa ng pagkain. Thought of food. It will further increase yung gastric secretions. Okay, di dadami lalo yung hydrochloric acid. Lalong mangangasim ang sikmura mo. Di ba? Ganun yun, no? Okay? Then, you have your gastric phase. Gastric phase is when there is already food in the stomach. No? Those partially digested proteins and distension of the stomach further promote increase of secretion. Yung kanina na nalalasahan mo pa lang, yung kanina na naaamoy mo pa lang, ngayon na-swallow mo na. Nakapasok na siya sa stomach. And it caused distension of the stomach already. So, that distension of the stomach sends signal also to your medulla oblongata. Feedback loop. Di ba? Alam niyo na naman ang mga feedback loop natin. Di ba? Sends signal to the medulla oblongata. And then from the medulla oblongata, the signal is sent back, no, to the stomach, which now stimulate the secretion. Okay? So, here, sa gastric phase, mas dumami pa yung gastric juices that is produced by the stomach. And then finally, your intestinal phase. Ibig sabihin nito, kapag intestinal phase, the chyme is already present in the intestines, particularly in the small intestine, in the duodenum. The entrance of chyme into the duodenum stimulates neuronal reflexes and secretion of certain hormones. What are those hormones? Secretin and cholecystokinin. Okay? Secretin and cholecystokinin are secreted by the duodenum, and they are released in the blood, and therefore they inhibit the secretion and movement in the stomach. So ibig sabihin, kapag yung chyme pumapasok na sa intestine, yung ating duodenum will be stimulated, and they will release again secretin and cholecystokinin. Ang effect pala nun, inhibitory. Kapag ka pala ang pagkain nasa small intestine na, magsisimula ng magbawas ng secretion ang ating stomach. And that is the intestinal phase. So again, the gastric secretions can be divided into the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. Okay. Yan. Sige. Ito hindi, will not include this anymore. Yan. Doon na tayo sa small intestines. The small intestines, usually measures up to 6 meters in length. Ganun siya kahaba. And because of that length, okay, the time takes about 3 to 5 hours to pass through the entire length of the small intestine. And as a result, it is effective as an absorptive organ of the gastrointestinal tract. In fact, it's a major absorptive organ. Okay? So dito, meron pa ring mga enzymes, that is secreted by the epithelium of the small intestine. So may mga enzymes pa rin yan that are secreted to further break down the food that we eat. Okay? So let us continue. The first section of the small intestine is called the duodenum, and it is only 25 centimeters long. In your duodenum, it contains absorptive cells, goblet cells, granular cells, and endocrine cells. Also in the duodenum are microvilli and many folds. At as you have seen in the laboratory, it is in the duodenum where the secretions of the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas enters the digestive tract. Diyan sa duodenum pumapasok yung secretions of the liver, secretions of gallbladder, and the secretions of the pancreas. While the jejunum is the second part, is usually 2.5 meters long, and it is the primary site of nutrient absorption. While the last part is your ileum, which is about 3.5 meters long. Itong pinakamahabang section ng small intestine, 3.5 meters. Okay? So, as you can see, although it is not, here we cannot specifically distinguish yung jejunum and ileum, pero yung duodenum can easily be distinguished because it is the section, first section, that is C-shaped. Hindi siya talaga coiled, but rather C-shaped. While the jejunum and ileum are continuous with each other. Okay? Okay. Let us continue. So what are those cells that are located in the walls of the small intestine? You have absorptive cells, goblet cells, granular cells, and endocrine cells. Absorptive cells functions mainly for absorption. So therefore, it possesses many microvilli, digestive enzymes, and absorb digested food. While goblet cells, yun pa rin. Anong nilalabas ng goblet cells? Mucus. It produces protective mucus. While the granular cells, which may help protect the intestinal epithelium from bacteria, and endocrine cells produce regulatory hormones. So, basta pag endocrine, hormone ang nilalabas niya. Okay? Now, we will skip this already. Okay. Now, the epithelial cells in the small intestine, no, have enzymes, okay, bound to their free surfaces. So, ibig sabihin, yung mga epithelial cells sa small intestine natin, naglalabas din ng enzymes. Ano mga enzymes ang nilalabas nila? Yung mga peptidases and disaccharidases. Peptidase, enzymatically breaks down protein into amino acids for absorption. Okay? So, kung sa stomach, si pepsin, di ba? Sinisimulan niyang i-break down si protein, no, into shorter peptide chains. Pagdating pala sa small intestine, no, yung mga peptide chains na yon ni protein is further enzymatically broken down by enzymes called peptidases. Another enzyme that is present in the small intestine is your disaccharidases. Disaccharidases naman, enzymatically break down disaccharides, no, into monosaccharides so that it can be easily absorbed by the small intestine. Okay? So, tandaan yung mga enzymes present in the small intestine, peptidases and disaccharidases. Saan galing ang disaccharides? Galing yan sa carbohydrates. No? Okay? Galing din yan from the fruits that we eat. No? These are sugar, pero hindi pa simple sugar ang disaccharidases. Kasi dalawa pa, di nga, meaning two molecules pa ang laman niya. Okay? Once it is digested, no, wherein the covalent bonds are already broken, mahihiwalay-hiwalay na yung molecules. So, solo-solo na yung molecules. It is now called monosaccharide. And what kind of monosaccharide do we get from carbohydrates? It's glucose. Glucose. Okay? Sige. Okay. Yan. Na tayo. You already discussed this in the laboratory. Yan, liver. Okay. Yan. That was discussed also in the laboratory. Okay. Okay na yan. Okay natin yan. Yan. Okay. No. So, sige. Mababanggit natin yan dito sa yan, digestive process. So let's skip those slides and let's proceed to the digestive process. So the digestive process taking place in our gastrointestinal tract is divided into three: digestion, absorption, and transport. Digestion is the chemical and mechanical breakdown of food, chemical and mechanical digestion. While absorption, no, okay, is when those digested materials, no, such as, again, di ba, sabi nga natin, yung carbohydrates is broken down into monosaccharides, while yung lipids or fats broken down into fatty acids. And when protein is broken down into amino acids, it is now ready to be absorbed in the small intestines. And most of that absorption occurs in the duodenum and in the jejunum. Okay? No? And the last is yung transport, wherein, no, it involves the movement of food through the digestive tract, which includes swallowing and peristalsis. This is what I'm telling you about, no? Okay? That the food that we eat can be divided into three groups, such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Carbohydrates, no, is broken down into smaller molecules called monosaccharides. Because we cannot absorb carbohydrates, masyadong malaki yan. Compound pa yan eh. Marami pang molecules na magkakadikit yan. So it should be broken down into smaller molecules in the form of simple sugars or monosaccharides. And lipids should be broken down into fatty acids and monoglycerides before being absorbed, while proteins are broken down into amino acids. Ha? Okay? So basically, no, ito yung pinaka summary, no, of how anong tawag dito? Carbohydrates, lipids, no, and protein is digested. Okay? So again, carbohydrates, no? Carbohydrates is digested, no? In the oral cavity pa lang, nagsisimula na siya, by the action of salivary amylase, no? Samantalang yung protein, no, starts its digestion in the stomach through the action of pepsin. Di ba? No? While yun namang fatty acids or fats, no? Okay? Nagsisimula ang digestion niyan in the duodenum through the action of bile. Anong ginagawa ng bile sa fats or lipids, no? Yung tinatawag nating fat emulsification. So that's the first step, no? So that's the first step of fat digestion, fat emulsification. And when we say fat emulsification, it is when bile, no, okay, breaks down fat into smaller droplets. Emulsification. Teka lang. Into smaller droplets. And by breaking it down into smaller droplets, mas madali. Ay, ba yan? Emulsification. Yan. So the process, no, initiated by bile, no, doon sa ating fats. Okay? Sige. Ito. Okay na. Sige. And that ends our discussion for the